Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The lion-embossed vambrace caught the dying light as Jon tightened the leather straps with practiced precision. His breath misted in the cooling air, a sight that should have been foreign after 15 years in the south. Yet something deep in his chest recognized it. Not memory exactly, for he had been barely a year old when Lord Tywin Lannister had claimed him from Winterfell. Rather, it was something older, something that lived in his blood and bones despite a lifetime of careful southern cultivation. The scent hit him as he flexed his fingers within the crimson-lined gauntlets. Pine and earth. The bite of northern cold that seemed to seep through even the finest Lannister steel. For a moment something wild stirred beneath his perfectly tailored exterior. A restlessness that 15 years of tutors and masters had never quite managed to tame. "You're doing it again," came a familiar voice from behind him. Jon turned to find Tyrion Lannister approaching, wine cup already in hand, despite the early evening hour. The dwarf's mismatched eyes held their usual mixture of amusement and shrewd calculation as he studied Jon's face. "Doing what, my lord?" Jon replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had been drilled into him by a dozen different tutors over the years. "That thing where you stand perfectly still and yet somehow manage to look like a caged wolf." Tyrion took a sip of wine and gestured vaguely at Jon's posture. "Very dramatic, I'm sure, but it makes the rest of us nervous." Jon felt his lips twitch despite himself. "I was merely contemplating the landscape, my lord." "Oh, contemplating." Tyrion nodded sagely, much more dignified than brooding, "though I notice you've been doing rather a lot of contemplating since we crossed the neck. One might almost think you were eager to see your birthplace again." The words carried a subtle warning, and Jon straightened almost imperceptibly. Even here, hundreds of miles from King's Landing, Cersei's eyes and ears were everywhere. Tyrion's casual observations were rarely as casual as they seemed. "I find the northern climate invigorating," Jon said carefully. "After so many years in the capital, the clean air is refreshing." "Diplomatically phrased," Tyrion chuckled. "Though what you mean to say is that it doesn't reek of piss and rotting fish." A fair observation, though perhaps not one to voice too loudly around certain members of our party. Jon's hand moved unconsciously to adjust his doublet. Deep red silk with golden lions embroidered across the chest. Everything about his appearance spoke of Lannister wealth and refinement, from his perfectly polished boots to the ceremonial sword at his hip. Yet beneath it all, that strange restlessness continued to stir. "Speaking of our party," Tyrion continued, settling himself on a fallen log with practiced ease, "you might want to work on that posture of yours. You're standing like you're about to receive a formal audience with the Iron Throne itself." "I was taught that proper bearing reflects proper breeding," Jon replied, though he did relax his shoulders slightly. "Yes, well, proper breeding is all well and good, but you're making the rest of us look slovenly by comparison." Tyrion's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Less lion, more human, if you please. We're camping on the King's Road, not holding court in the Red Keep." Before Jon could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Prince Joffrey rode into the circle of firelight, his golden hair gleaming despite the dust of travel. At 17 he had grown tall and lean, with the sharp beauty of his mother and an arrogance that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. "Uncle," Joffrey said with a curt nod to Tyrion before his pale green eyes fixed on Jon and the ward. "How quaint to find you both lurking about like common soldiers." Jon offered a perfectly calibrated bow, deep enough to show respect, shallow enough to maintain dignity. 15 years of living under Lannister scrutiny had taught him the precise mathematics of deference. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "I trust your ride was pleasant?" Joffrey dismounted with theatrical flourish, tossing his reins to a nearby groom with careless arrogance. His gaze fell to the sword at Jon's hip, and his lip curled in familiar disdain. "Still carrying that plain thing, I see," the prince observed, his voice dripping with mockery. "One would think Lord Tywin might have seen fit to arm his pet with something more appropriate to his station." Jon's sword was indeed plain. Good steel, well balanced, but without the ornate decoration that marked weapons of the nobility. It had been a gift from Sir Jaime on Jon's 16th name day, chosen, the knight had said with rare sincerity, for its practicality rather than its beauty. "I find it serves its purpose admirably, your grace," Jon replied evenly. "And what purpose would that be?" Joffrey's voice carried a mocking edge. Cutting your meat at dinner? Surely you don't fancy yourself a warrior. From the shadows near the horses, Sandor Clegane emerged like some great hound scenting prey. The burned ruin of his face was impassive, but there was something in his dark eyes that might have been amusement as he watched the exchange. Every blade has its purpose, Jon said carefully, his tone remaining level despite the provocation. Some are made for ceremony, others for use. I prefer to know the difference. Tyrion chuckled into his wine cup. Wisely spoken, though I suspect our young prince here has never had to concern himself with such mundane distinctions. When one is heir to the Iron Throne, every sword is ceremonial by default. Joffrey's face flushed at the implied criticism, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. Joffrey! Queen Cersei approached with her characteristic grace, her golden hair catching the firelight like a crown. She wore traveling clothes of deep green silk that somehow managed to look more regal than most women's court gowns. Her green eyes swept over the assembled group before settling on Jon with that familiar mixture of possession and calculation. Mother, Joffrey said, his tone immediately shifting to something approaching respect. Your father requires your presence, Cersei said without preamble. There are matters to discuss regarding tomorrow's arrival. Joffrey's jaw tightened. He clearly had no desire to endure another of Robert's lectures, but he nodded stiffly. Of course, mother. As the prince stalked away, Cersei's attention turned fully to Jon. He felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing, measuring and evaluating with the precision of a master craftsman examining a particularly valuable tool. Walk with me, she said, though it was clearly not a request. Jon fell into step beside her as they moved away from the fire, leaving Tyrion and Sandor behind. The queen's perfume, something floral and expensive, seemed out of place in the wild northern landscape, a reminder of the southern world that had shaped him. You seem restless tonight, Cersei observed as they walked. More so than usual. Jon chose his words carefully. The journey has been illuminating, Your Grace. It's educational to see different parts of the realm. Educational, Cersei's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. Such a careful word. Tell me, Jon, what exactly has this education taught you? The trap was there in her voice, subtle but unmistakable. Jon had learned to recognize the signs over the years. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them, the particular cadence that meant she was testing him. That the realm is vast and varied, Your Grace. That your subjects live in many different ways, but all under the same crown. My subjects, Cersei repeated softly. Yes, I suppose they are, including your former guardians. The words hit like a carefully placed dagger thrust. Former guardians. As if the Starks had been nothing more than temporary caretakers, holding him in trust until his true family could claim him. I serve at your pleasure, Your Grace, Jon said, the formula as familiar as breathing, as I have since Lord Tywin brought me into his household. Indeed you have. Cersei stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, her beauty was almost ethereal, but there was steel beneath the silk. And you've served well, learned your lessons, minded your manners, been everything we could have hoped for in a ward. Jon waited, sensing more to come. But tomorrow we arrive at Winterfell, Cersei continued, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. The place where you drew your first breath. The seat of the family that shaped your earliest months. I find myself curious about how that might affect you. I understand your concern, Your Grace, Jon said carefully, but my loyalties are clear. Lord Tywin took me in when I was barely more than an infant. Gave me education, position, purpose. I am grateful for House Lannister's generosity, and I would never forget the debt I owe. Cersei studied his face for a long moment, her green eyes searching for any hint of deception. Finally she smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and threatening. Good, she said simply, because tomorrow will be interesting. Robert is determined to make a grand show of this visit, and I suspect Lord Stark will be equally eager to demonstrate northern hospitality. There will be many eyes watching, many ears listening. I trust you understand the importance of proper behavior. Of course, Your Grace. Excellent. Cersei reached out and adjusted his collar with the casual intimacy of ownership. You look well in red and gold, Jon. It has always suited you far better than gray and white ever could have. With that, she glided away, leaving Jon standing alone in the darkness. He remained motionless for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the camp settling in for the night. Horses snorting and stamping, men talking quietly around their fires, the distant call of some night bird. As he finally made his way back toward his tent, Jon's mind drifted to a memory from his childhood at Casterly Rock. He had been perhaps 7 years old, still awkward in his lessons, still struggling to master the complex web of courtesies and protocols that governed noble life. The lesson that day had been with Maester Balabar, a thin, nervous man who served as one of Lord Tywin's many advisors. They had been practicing formal greetings, the precise angle required for different ranks, the proper duration, the subtle variations that could convey respect, deference, or barely concealed insult. "Remember," the Maester had said, his voice high and reedy, "gratitude is currency in the great game. Every courtesy you show, every gesture of respect, every moment of deference, these are investments. Someday when you need favor, or mercy, or simply to be overlooked, you will spend this currency. Spend it wisely." Jon had nodded, filing the lesson away with all the others. Even then he had understood that he was being shaped into something specific, though he hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what that meant. Now 15 years later he understood perfectly. He was to be the perfect ward, grateful, loyal, useful, a living reminder of Lannister magnanimity and power. A bastard raised to heights he could never have achieved on his own, forever in debt to the family that had lifted him up. Jon ducked into his tent and began the methodical process of removing his formal attire. The interior was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A narrow cot, a camp chair, a small table holding his personal effects. Everything was neat and precisely arranged, a habit ingrained by years of living under exacting standards. As he worked, his mind turned to tomorrow's arrival at Winterfell. What would he find there? What would the Starks see when they looked at him? A son returning home, or a stranger wearing familiar features? The truth was, he barely remembered them. It is long ago when he saw them at a meeting. Lord Eddard Stark was a distant figure in his earliest memories, tall and gray-eyed and somehow sad. Lady Catelyn was even more remote, a beautiful woman who had looked at him with something that might have been pity or resentment. The children were mere shadows, Robb's laughter, Sansa's songs, baby Arya's fierce grip on his finger. But those were the memories of a very young boy, filtered through 15 years of southern living. Whatever connections he might have had to that place, to those people, had been severed long ago. He was a Lannister ward now, shaped by their values and devoted to their interests. So why did the thought of seeing Winterfell again make his chest tight with something that felt dangerously like longing? Jon settled onto his cot and closed his eyes, but sleep was slow in coming. Outside the wind had picked up, carrying with it scents that stirred something deep in his memory. Pine and snow, leather and steel, the earthy smell of rich northern soil. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound sent a shiver down Jon's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He sat up, listening intently, but the howl didn't come again. Still, something about it resonated in his chest, as if answering a call he hadn't known he was waiting for. Ridiculous, he told himself firmly. You're not a Stark, you never were. You're a ward of House Lannister, raised in their halls and shaped by their will. But even as he repeated the familiar litany, part of him strained toward that distant howl, towards something wild and free that no amount of courtly training could quite suppress. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost glittering on the grass, and their breath misting in the morning air. Jon woke before his body servant arrived, a habit from his early days at Casterly Rock, when he had learned that being prepared was always preferable to being caught off guard. He dressed with particular care in his finest traveling clothes, a doublet of deep crimson silk, with golden lions embroidered across the chest, black leather breeches tucked into polished boots, a cloak of Lannister red lined with cloth of gold. The effect was magnificent and entirely deliberate. He looked every inch the highborn lord, despite the circumstances of his birth. The camp was already stirring when he emerged from his tent. Servants scurried about, breaking down pavilions and loading wagons with practiced efficiency. The royal party had traveled with a train nearly 300 strong, and the logistics of moving so many people and so much equipment required careful coordination. "Jon!" Tyrion's voice cut through the morning bustle. The dwarf was seated on a camp stool outside his own tent, breaking his fast with bread and cheese while a servant packed his belongings. "Come, join me. I find myself in need of civilized conversation before we're subjected to whatever passes for northern hospitality." Jon accepted the invitation gratefully, settling onto a nearby stool and accepting a cup of watered wine. The bread was still warm from the ovens, and the cheese was sharp and creamy, luxuries that would have been unthinkable for most bastards. Nervous? Tyrion asked, studying Jon's face with those mismatched eyes. Should I be? That depends entirely on what you're hoping to find there. Tyrion tore off a piece of bread and chewed thoughtfully. Homecomings are tricky things. We build up expectations, imagine how things will be, and reality rarely matches our dreams. Winterfell was never truly my home, Jon said carefully. I was an infant there, a ward from the beginning. But that's not quite the same thing, is it? Tyrion's voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath the kindness. You may not remember it, but it's still the place where you began. That leaves marks, whether we acknowledge them or not. Before Jon could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. King Robert rode into view, his massive frame somehow still impressive, despite the years of excess that had thickened his waist and softened his features. Behind him rode Sir Jaime Lannister, golden and beautiful as a god of war, and Queen Cersei, regal as always, despite the early hour. Jon, Robert's voice boomed across the camp. There you are, lad, ready to see the place where you drew your first breath. Jon rose immediately, offering the king a perfect bow. Your grace. Robert waved the formality aside with characteristic impatience. None of that now, we're practically family, after all. The king's small dark eyes studied Jon with something that might have been approval. 15 years you've been with us now. Hard to believe you were just a babe when Tywin brought you south. Lord Tywin has been most generous, your grace. Aye, he has that. Robert's gaze flicked to his wife, and something passed between them. Some communication Jon couldn't quite read. Tell me, lad, what do you remember of the North, of the Starks? The question seemed casual enough, but Jon sensed weight behind it. This was not idle curiosity. There was purpose here, though he couldn't see its shape. Very little, your grace. I was barely a year old when I came south. I remember impressions, perhaps. The cold, the sound of wind in the trees. Robert nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. Well, you'll see it all properly now, won't you? Ned Stark will get quite a surprise seeing what you've become. There was something in the king's tone that made Jon uneasy, though he couldn't put his finger on what. It sounded almost like anticipation, as if Robert was looking forward to some sort of confrontation or revelation. I serve at your pleasure, your grace, Jon said, falling back on the familiar formula. That you do, lad, that you do. Robert clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to stagger a smaller man. Well, no point in delaying the inevitable. Let's see what the North has to offer a king, shall we? The final preparations took another hour, but finally the great column began to move. Jon rode with the royal party, his position carefully calculated to demonstrate his status without overstepping bounds. He was mounted on a fine destrier, a gift from Lord Tywin on his 15th name day, and his gear was the equal of any lord's son. As they crested the final hill and Winterfell came into view, Jon felt his breath catch in his throat. The ancient seat of House Stark rose from the landscape like something grown rather than built, its gray walls weathered by centuries of northern winters. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys and banners flew from the towers, the gray direwolf of House Stark on its field of white and gray. The sight of those banners sent something through Jon that he couldn't name, not memory, for he had been too young to remember such things. But something deeper, something that lived in his blood and made his heart beat faster despite 15 years of southern living. Impressive, isn't it? Tyrion had ridden up beside him, following his gaze. All that history, all that tradition, the Starks have held this place for 8,000 years, they say. So they claim, Jon replied, though there was something in his voice that he couldn't quite suppress. A note of, what? Pride? Longing? He wasn't sure. The great gates of Winterfell swung open as they approached, and the royal party rode into the courtyard. Jon's eyes swept over the assembled household, taking in faces both familiar and strange. 15 years had changed everyone, himself included. And there, standing at the center of it all, was Eddard Stark. The Lord of Winterfell looked older than Jon had expected, gray threading through his brown hair and new lines around his eyes. But he stood straight and proud, every inch the great lord. And when his gray eyes met Jon's across the courtyard, something passed between them. Recognition, surprise, and something else, something that made Jon's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. For a moment Jon forgot where he was, forgot his carefully constructed identity, forgot everything except those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through him. His body moved without conscious thought, beginning to sink into a bow deeper than protocol demanded, the instinctive gesture of a son to his father. But training reasserted itself just in time. He was not Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell. He was Jon, ward of House Lannister, representative of Southern power and Lannister interests. His bow, when it came, was perfectly calibrated, respectful but not subservient, acknowledging Ned's rank without diminishing his own position. "Lord Stark," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "It is an honor to return to Winterfell." Ned's eyes flickered. With what? Jon couldn't say. Disappointment? Relief? Pain? "Jon, the Lord of Winterfell," replied, his voice carefully neutral. "You are welcome here." Welcome, not welcome home. Just welcome. The formal greetings continued around him, Robert embracing Ned like the old friends they were, Cersei accepting courtesies with regal grace, the Stark children being presented to their royal guests. Jon watched it all with the detached interest of an observer, cataloging faces and noting changes. Robb had grown tall and strong, every inch his father's son. Sansa was blossoming into a beauty that would break hearts across the Seven Kingdoms. Arya was still wild and fierce, though she had gained some height and lost some of her childish roundness. Bran looked exactly as a Stark should, curious and bright-eyed, eager for adventure. And there was little Rickon, who had been born after Jon left and was now a boy of 6 with the Stark look stamped clearly on his features. They looked at him with varying degrees of curiosity and weariness. He was familiar but foreign, known but changed, the bastard brother who had become something else entirely. As the crowd began to disperse and the royal party was escorted toward the Great Hall, Jon found himself momentarily alone in the courtyard. The stones beneath his feet were the same ones he had crawled across as an infant, but everything else had changed. He had changed. A wolf howled in the distance, the same sound he had heard the night before, or perhaps another of the pack. The sound sent that same strange shiver through him, as if something deep inside was trying to wake up. But Jon Snow was gone, buried beneath 15 years of careful cultivation and deliberate transformation. What remained was something else, something that served Lannister interests, and wore Lannister colors and spoke with a Lannister voice. Even if sometimes in the dark of night he still dreamed of gray walls and winter roses, of belonging somewhere without question or condition. As he followed the others toward the Great Hall, Jon caught sight of movement in one of the upper windows. A flash of auburn hair, a pale face pressed against the glass. Lady Catelyn Stark, watching him with those blue eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, only the careful assessment of a stranger, which, he supposed, was exactly what he was. The Great Hall of Winterfell was exactly as he might have imagined. Long tables of dark wood, tapestries depicting the history of House Stark, the smell of roasted meat and ale and burning wood. But he sat at the high table now, not far from the king himself, rather than wherever bastard infants might have been placed 15 years ago. The conversation flowed around him, talk of the journey, news from King's Landing, questions about the state of the realm. Jon participated when spoken to, offering the sort of polished responses that 15 years of training had made second nature. But part of his attention was elsewhere, cataloging the faces around him, noting the way the Stark children stole glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. He was a curiosity to them, the bastard brother who had become a southern lord, familiar features wearing unfamiliar colors. As the evening wore on and the ale flowed more freely, the atmosphere in the hall grew more relaxed. Stories were told, songs were sung, and for a few moments it was possible to forget the undercurrents of politics and obligation that ran beneath every interaction. Jon found himself genuinely enjoying the company, particularly when Tyrion regaled the table with tales of his travels and misadventures. The dwarf had a gift for storytelling, and even the normally reserved northern lords found themselves laughing at his wit. But as the night deepened and the guests began to retire, Jon felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. He had navigated the reunion successfully, maintained his composure, played his part, but it had cost him something, some piece of himself that he couldn't quite name. He made his way to the guest quarters assigned to him, a comfortable chamber in the great keep that spoke of Stark hospitality without being ostentatious. As he prepared for bed, Jon found his thoughts turning to the wolf howl he had heard. Somewhere out there in the darkness, wolves ran free under the northern stars. Somewhere out there, creatures lived and died by their own choices, answerable to no one but themselves and the wild. But that was not his world. His world was one of silk and gold, of careful words and calculated gestures, of service and gratitude and the endless dance of court politics. As he settled into bed, Jon tried to quiet his racing thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his loyalty and discretion. The king would continue his visit, Cersei would watch and calculate, and Jon would play his part in whatever drama unfolded. But as sleep finally began to claim him, that distant howl echoed in his mind like a song he had almost forgotten, and for just a moment he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to answer that call, to cast off the red and gold, to discover who he might have been if he had grown up gray and white instead. The howl came again, closer now, and something deep in Jon's chest answered it with a longing he didn't dare acknowledge. But he was a lion now. Tame and collared and utterly dependent on his keeper's goodwill. Even if, sometimes in the dark of night, he still dreamed of running wild and free. Ned Stark sat at the high table of his own great hall, watching a ghost wear his sister's face. The young man who called himself Jon, no surname, for bastards had no need of such things. Even bastards raised as lords moved through the evening's courtesies with the fluid grace of a trained courtier. Every gesture was measured, every word carefully chosen, every smile precisely calibrated to convey the proper degree of warmth without overstepping bounds. It was a masterful performance, and it made Ned's heart ache with a pain that had never truly faded. 15 years. 15 years since he had made the hardest choice of his life, trading his honor for his sister's dying wish and his nephew's safety. 15 years of watching from afar as Tywin Lannister shaped the boy into something useful, something loyal, something that bore no resemblance to the fierce, wild-hearted woman who had died bringing him into the world. Magnificent vintage, this, King Robert declared loudly, raising his cup of Dornish red toward the rafters. Wine had already flushed his face and loosened his tongue, though the feast had barely begun. Nothing like northern hospitality to remind a man what he's been missing in that cesspit of a capital. Ned forced a smile and raised his own cup in response. Winterfell's cellars are yours, your grace, as is everything else under this roof. Robert's laugh boomed across the hall, drawing smiles from the assembled lords and ladies. But Ned's attention was elsewhere, fixed on the young man seated 3 places down from the queen. Jon sat with perfect posture, his hands folded precisely in his lap when not in use, his expression one of polite interest as he listened to some tale Lord Hornwood was telling. Everything about him spoke of southern refinement, the cut of his clothes, the way he held his wine cup, even the careful modulation of his voice when he spoke. But underneath it all, Ned could see the bones of his heritage, the long face that marked him as a Stark, the gray eyes that were Lyanna's own, the way he held his head when he was thinking deeply. "Promise me, Ned." The words echoed in his mind as they had countless times over the years, spoken in a voice that had grown weaker with each passing hour until it was barely a whisper. Lyanna's hand had been so cold in his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. "Promise me you'll keep him safe." And he had promised, had sworn on everything he held sacred that he would protect the child, would see him raised and cared for and kept from the dangers that his true parentage would bring. But keeping that promise had required sacrifices Ned had never imagined when he spoke the words. "That word of yours has certainly turned out well," Robert said, his voice cutting through Ned's reverie. The king was looking down the table at Jon with something that might have been approval. "Fine bearing, good manners. Credit to Tywin's household, I'd say." Ned's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lord Tywin has always been thorough in his methods. Thorough, yes. Robert took another deep drink. Knows how to get results, that one. Look at the boy, speaks like a lord. Carries himself like a lord. Probably fights like one too. Better than some I could name. The king's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Prince Joffrey, who was holding court at the far end of the table, with several young northern lords. The prince's voice was rising as he regaled them with some tale of his prowess at arms, his gestures becoming increasingly animated as the wine took hold. Queen Cersei's green eyes flashed with something dangerous at her husband's implied criticism of their son, but she said nothing. Her own attention seemed fixed on Jon, watching him with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse. "Discipline," Robert continued, apparently oblivious to his wife's displeasure. "That's what makes the difference. The Lannisters understand that. Shape a boy properly from the start, and you'll have a man worth having when he's grown." Ned forced himself to nod, though the words felt like daggers in his chest. Shape a boy properly, as if Jon were some piece of metal to be hammered into a desired form, rather than a child with his own nature and desires. But that was exactly what had happened, wasn't it? Tywin Lannister had taken a 1-year-old infant and molded him into the perfect ward. Grateful, loyal, useful, a living reminder of Lannister power and magnanimity. Forever in debt to the family that had raised him. "He seems content," Ned said carefully, choosing his words with the same precision Jon himself might have used. "Content?" Robert laughed. "He should be more than content. The boy's been given opportunities most bastards could never dream of. Education, position, a place at court. Hell, he's probably better off than he would have been if you'd kept him here." The casual cruelty of the words hit Ned like a physical blow. Better off. As if being torn from his birthright, and raised by the family that had orchestrated his grandfather's and uncle's deaths, was somehow a kindness. But Robert didn't know. Couldn't know. The truth of Jon's parentage was a secret that would die with Ned, because revealing it would mean the boy's death, as surely as if Ned put a blade through his heart himself. Robert's hatred of all things Targaryen ran too deep, burned too hot. He would never accept that his beloved Lyanna had chosen Rhaegar willingly, had married him in secret, and died bearing his child. "Perhaps," Ned said quietly, lifting his cup to his lips to avoid saying more. The feast continued around them, the great hall filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Minstrels played, servants moved efficiently between the tables, and the assembled lords and ladies of the north made polite conversation with their royal guests. On the surface, it was everything a welcome feast should be. But Ned felt as if he were watching it all from a great distance, separated from the warmth and fellowship by the weight of his secrets. Every time he looked at Jon, he saw Lyanna's face superimposed over the young man's features. Every time he heard the boy speak in that carefully modulated southern accent, he wondered what his voice might have sounded like if he had grown up speaking with a northern burr. "What would you think of what he's become?" Ned wondered, directing the thought toward a sister 15 years dead. "Would you be proud of his accomplishments? Or would you weep to see how far he strayed from his true nature?" There was no answer, of course. The dead kept their own counsel, leaving the living to wrestle with the consequences of choices made in desperation and grief. As the evening wore on, Ned found himself studying the interactions between Jon and the royal family. The young man was deferential without being servile, engaging without being presumptuous. He laughed at Tyrion's jokes, listened respectfully to Robert's stories, and responded to Cersei's occasional comments, with perfect courtesy. But there was something underneath it all, a careful distance that spoke of years spent walking on knife's edge. Jon was performing, Ned realized, playing a role he had been taught to perfection, but a role nonetheless. The thought made something twist in Ned's chest. This was what his promise had bought. Safety, yes, but at the cost of the boy's true self. Jon was alive and well-educated, and positioned to make something of himself in the world, but he was also a stranger wearing a familiar face, shaped by forces that had turned him into something his mother would barely recognize. "You're brooding again," Catelyn's voice was soft beside him, meant for his ears alone. Ned turned to look at his wife, taking in the concern in her blue eyes. She had been watching him, he realized, noting his distraction and the way his gaze kept returning to the Lannister ward. "Am I?" he said, attempting a smile. "My apologies. I was merely thinking about him." Catelyn's gaze flicked briefly toward Jon before returning to her husband's face. It must be strange seeing him again after so many years. Strange. Yes, that was one word for it. Though it hardly began to encompass the tangle of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him every time he looked at the young man who should have been his heir. His son in truth as well as in name. "He's changed," Ned said simply. "Of course he has. He was barely more than an infant when he left." Catelyn's voice was carefully neutral, but Ned could hear the old pain underneath. She had never been comfortable with Jon's presence at Winterfell, had never been able to look at him without seeing a reminder of what she believed to be her husband's infidelity. The Lannisters have clearly invested considerable effort in his education. "Yes," Ned agreed, "they have." What else could he say? That every word Jon spoke in that polished southern accent was like a knife in his heart. That watching the boy defer to Cersei Lannister with such careful respect made him want to rage against the cruel necessities that had forced such a choice. The feast was winding down now, the wine having done its work on the assembled guests. Robert was deep in conversation with several northern lords, regaling them with tales of battles fought and won in their youth. Cersei was speaking quietly with her ladies, her green eyes still occasionally flicking toward Jon with that calculating intensity. And Jon himself was listening politely to some story Maester Lewin was telling, nodding at appropriate intervals, and asking the sort of thoughtful questions that marked him as both intelligent and well-educated. He should be sitting at my right hand, Ned thought with sudden fierce longing. He should be learning to rule, to lead, to carry on the Stark name and traditions. Instead, he's a guest in his own birthplace, wearing another family's colors and serving their interests. But such thoughts were dangerous, and Ned pushed them aside with the practiced ease of nearly 2 decades. Jon was safe, that was what mattered. Whatever else had been lost, whatever sacrifices had been made, the boy was alive and well and positioned to make his own way in the world. It would have to be enough. As the evening finally drew to a close, and the guests began to disperse to their chambers, Ned caught Jon's eye across the hall. For a moment their gazes met and held, and Ned saw something flicker in those gray eyes, a flash of, what, recognition, longing, pain. But then it was gone, replaced by the careful mask of courtesy that seemed to be Jon's default expression. The young man offered a perfectly calibrated bow in Ned's direction before following the other Lannister party members toward the guest quarters. Ned watched him go, noting the straight line of his shoulders, the measured pace of his steps, the way he held himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged in the world's hierarchy. Lyanna's son, he thought. The words both a prayer and a lament. What have I allowed them to make of you? The solar was quiet in the way that only came in the deep hours of the night, when even the servants had retired, and Winterfell settled into the peaceful stillness that preceded dawn. Ned sat behind his desk, a cup of wine growing cold at his elbow as he stared at the object in his hands. It was a small thing, hardly larger than his thumb, a winter rose carved from pale blue stone, so delicately crafted that the petals seemed almost translucent in the candlelight. He had commissioned it years ago from a master craftsman in White Harbor, working from memory and a desperate need to hold on to something tangible of his sister. Lyanna had loved winter roses, had woven them into her hair, tucked them behind her ear, filled her chambers with their delicate beauty whenever they bloomed in the glass gardens. She had been holding one when she died, her fingers wrapped around the stem so tightly that the thorns had drawn blood. Promise me, Ned. The words echoed in the silence of the solar, as clear as if she had spoken them moments ago rather than 15 years past. He could still see her face in those final moments, pale and drawn with pain, but still beautiful, still fierce even as life ebbed away from her. Promise me you'll keep him safe. And he had promised, though he hadn't understood then what that promise would cost. Hadn't realized that keeping Jon safe would mean watching him grow up as someone else's child, shaped by someone else's values, loyal to someone else's interests. Ned turned the carved rose over in his hands, feeling the smooth coolness of the stone against his palm. How many times had he held this small token over the years, wrestling with the weight of his choices? How many sleepless nights had he spent wondering if there might have been another way? Ned had lied, had claimed the child as his own bastard, born of some meaningless dalliance during the war, had endured Catelyn's pain and disappointment, had watched her struggle to accept the presence of what she believed to be her husband's illegitimate son in their home. And when Tywin Lannister had come calling with his offer, couched in terms of alliance and goodwill, but carrying the implicit threat that refusing might have consequences, Ned had made the hardest choice of his life. He had let them take Jon away, for his own safety, Ned told himself, as he had countless times over the years, to keep him alive, to give him opportunities he could never have had as a bastard in the North. But watching Jon tonight, seeing the careful way he navigated every interaction, the practiced deference he showed to his captors, for what else could they be called, Ned wondered if he had simply traded one form of death for another. The boy was alive, yes, but was he truly living? Or was he simply existing as Tywin Lannister's perfectly crafted tool, shaped and molded to serve purposes that had nothing to do with his own desires or nature? A soft knock at the solar door interrupted his brooding. Ned quickly slipped the carved rose into a drawer before calling for his visitor to enter. Maester Lewin stepped into the room, his gray robes rustling softly as he moved. The old man's face was creased with concern as he approached the desk, his hands folded within his sleeves. My lord, he said quietly, forgive the intrusion, but I saw the light beneath your door, and thought perhaps you might be in need of counsel. Ned gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit, old friend, though I fear my troubles are not the sort that can be easily counseled away. Lewin settled himself with the careful movements of advanced age, his pale eyes studying Ned's face with the shrewd intelligence that had made him invaluable over the years. The feast went well, the Maester observed. His grace seemed pleased with the hospitality, and the northern lords appeared to enjoy the opportunity to meet their royal guests. Yes, Ned agreed. It went as well as could be expected. The Lannister ward was interesting, Lewin continued, his tone carefully neutral, quite different from what I might have expected given his origins. Ned felt something cold settle in his stomach. In what way? Oh, merely in his bearing, his education. One might almost forget his humble beginnings, watching him tonight. The Lannisters have clearly invested considerable effort in his upbringing. Lewin paused, his eyes never leaving Ned's face. I confess myself curious about their motivations. It's not unheard of for great houses to take in the bastards of their allies, but the level of investment they've shown in this particular boy seems unusual. The question hung in the air between them, innocent on the surface but weighted with implications. Lewin had served House Stark for decades, had been present when Jon was born, had helped with the deception that had protected the boy's true identity. But even he didn't know the full truth, couldn't know for his own safety as much as Jon's. Alliance building, Ned said smoothly, the lie coming easier after so many years of practice. Tywin Lannister has always understood the value of goodwill. Taking in the bastard of a potential ally, raising him well, it creates bonds of gratitude and obligation that can be useful in future negotiations. Lewin nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. Of course, though one might wonder why they chose to bring him north with the royal party. Surely his presence here might be awkward, given the circumstances of his departure. Perhaps they wished to demonstrate their success, Ned said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. To show how well they fulfilled their obligations to their ward. Perhaps, Lewin agreed, though his tone suggested he had his own theories about Lannister motivations. The Maester was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly against the arm of his chair. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully casual. He has the look of a Stark about him still, despite all their efforts. The bone structure, the way he holds himself when he thinks no one is watching. Blood will tell, as they say. Ned's hand tightened involuntarily around his wine cup. Will it? Oh yes, Lewin said softly. It always does in the end. No matter how carefully we might try to shape someone into something they're not, their true nature has a way of asserting itself. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Ned found himself wondering how much the old Maester suspected. Lewin had always been perceptive, had always seen more than he let on, but he had also always been discreet, had always understood the value of keeping certain truths buried. The boy seems content with his lot, Ned said carefully. Does he? Lewin's pale eyes were knowing. I watched him tonight, my lord. Watched the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he held himself. He's been well trained, I'll grant you that. But there was something underneath it all. A restlessness, perhaps. A sense that he was performing rather than simply being. Ned said nothing, but something in his expression must have given him away, because Lewin leaned forward slightly. You're worried about him, the Maester said quietly. Not just as a former guardian, but as something more. You see something in him that troubles you. I see a young man who has been shaped by forces beyond his control, Ned said finally, who has been molded into something that serves others' purposes rather than his own. And you wonder what might have been, if circumstances had been different. It wasn't a question and Ned didn't treat it as one. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths heavy in the air between them. There are rumors, Lewin said eventually, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Whispers in the capital about the Queen's particular interest in her ward. Some say she keeps him close for reasons that have nothing to do with gratitude or alliance building. Ned felt ice form in his veins. What sort of rumors? The sort that are dangerous to repeat, and even more dangerous to investigate. Lewin's expression was grave, but if they're true, the boy may be in more peril than either of us realized. The implications hit Ned like a physical blow. He had worried about Jon's emotional well-being, about the way the Lannisters had shaped him into their perfect tool, but he hadn't allowed himself to think about what other uses they might have for a young man with stark features and a grateful heart. "How reliable are these rumors?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Reliable enough to be concerning, unreliable enough to be unprovable." Lewin's fingers drummed against his chair again. "But my lord, if there's even a grain of truth to them, then he's in danger," Ned finished. "More danger than I ever imagined when I let them take him." The carved rose seemed to burn in the drawer where he had hidden it, a tangible reminder of the promise he had made, and the ways he had failed to keep it. He had thought he was protecting Jon by sending him away, by giving him opportunities and advantages he could never have had in the north. Instead, he might have delivered his nephew directly into the hands of those who would use and corrupt him in ways that made Ned's blood run cold. "What would you have me do?" Ned asked quietly. "The boy is their ward, legally and officially. I have no claim on him, no right to interfere in his upbringing or his future." "Perhaps not officially," Lewin said carefully, "but there are other considerations, moral obligations that transcend legal niceties." The Maester paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "The king's visit will not last forever. When he leaves, he'll take his party with him, including the ward. But perhaps arrangements could be made. Opportunities created for the young man to remain behind, to rediscover his northern roots." "You're suggesting I try to reclaim him," Ned said, the words barely audible. "I'm suggesting that some debts transcend politics and expedience," Lewin replied. "Some promises require more than we initially understood when we made them." Ned closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years of guilt and regret pressing down on him like a physical thing. He had made his choice long ago, had traded his honor and his heart's desire for what he believed was his nephew's safety. But what if he had been wrong? What if the very people he had trusted to protect Jon were the ones he most needed protection from? "Promise me, Ned." Lyanna's voice echoed in his mind, as clear and urgent as it had been on that terrible day when she had pressed her son into his arms and begged him to keep the child safe. "I'll watch him," Ned said finally, the words feeling like another vow, another promise that might cost him everything. "While he's here, I'll watch him closely, and if I see any sign that he's truly in danger, then you'll do what needs to be done," Lewin finished. "As you always have." The Maester rose from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate. "I should let you rest, my lord. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." "Lewin," Ned called as the old man reached the door. "Thank you, for the counsel, and for everything else." Lewin's smile was sad but warm. "Some truths are too important to remain buried forever, my lord. Perhaps it's time to consider whether the cost of keeping this particular secret has grown too high." With that he was gone, leaving Ned alone with his thoughts and his guilt, and the small carved rose that represented everything he had lost, and everything he still hoped to save. Outside his window, Winterfell slept peacefully under the northern stars. But Ned knew that sleep would not come easily for him tonight. Not when his nephew, his sister's son, the last living piece of Lyanna Stark, was sleeping under the same roof, wearing another family's colors and serving their interests. "I should have fought harder," he thought, the familiar litany of regret playing through his mind. "Should have found another way, should have been stronger, should have kept him here where he belonged." But regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. What mattered now was the future. Jon's future, and whether it was too late to give him back some piece of what had been taken away. Ned pulled the carved rose from its drawer and held it up to the candlelight, watching the way the flame made the pale stone seem to glow from within. Somewhere in this castle, Jon was sleeping in a guest chamber, dreaming whatever dreams came to young men who had been raised to serve others' purposes. Did he ever dream of wolves running free under northern skies? Did he ever wonder what his life might have been like if he had grown up gray and white, instead of red and gold? "I'll find a way," Ned promised the carved rose, the words spoken to the memory of a sister who had died trusting him to protect her son. "I'll find a way to give him back some piece of what was taken, even if it cost me everything." The candle flickered in a draft from the window, casting dancing shadows on the solar walls. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of a wolf howling, wild and free and utterly untamed. The sound made something stir in Ned's chest, some echo of the wildness that had once run in Stark blood before duty and honor, and the weight of lordship had tamed it. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps Jon could still find his way back to who he was meant to be, underneath all the careful layers of southern polish. Perhaps there was still time to keep the promise that mattered most. But first, Ned would have to find the courage to risk everything he had built, everything he had protected, for the sake of a young man who might not even want to be saved. The carved rose seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, and for a moment Ned could almost hear Lyanna's voice again, not pleading this time, but encouraging. "It's not too late," she seemed to whisper. "It's never too late to do what's right." Ned closed his fingers around the small token and made himself a new promise, one that might finally allow him to sleep peacefully, if he could find the strength to keep it. Tomorrow he would begin to find a way to bring his nephew home,